Clara thought the polished chrome of the two German sedans in the driveway represented victory. She believed the neat stacks of cash withdrawn from their joint accounts, now nestled in her designer luggage, were the spoils of a war she had won before it had even been declared. She looked at David, her husband of 10 years, a man she had reshaped in her mind from a partner into a project, and from a project into a failure, and felt a final, cleansing wave of pity. He stood in the marble-floored hall of the house she would soon be selling, a ghost in his own life, his expression unreadable. "I've left the keys to the storage unit on the counter," she said, her voice not cruel but worse, indifferent. It was the tone one used for a distant cousin or a service provider. "It's all paid up for the year. You can have all that old junk." She gestured vaguely, a flick of a wrist laden with a diamond tennis bracelet David had bought her for their 5th anniversary. "Your dusty papers and little model buildings. Sentimental value, I'm sure." She didn't know that the old junk was a curated archive of architectural history worth $8 million. Within 3 months, that indifference would curdle into a desperation so potent it would strip the varnish from her carefully constructed life, revealing the cheap material beneath. We've all seen situations like this, haven't we? Where someone's worth is judged by what they have, not who they are. It's a story that plays out in homes and offices all over the world. Where are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments below. I love seeing how far these stories travel. If you enjoy seeing arrogance meet its match and quiet strength win the day, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. You won't want to miss how this unfolds. Now let's get back to David and the quiet storm that was about to break. The click of the front door closing was not a slam. It was a neat, decisive sound, the sound of a well-oiled machine doing its job. It was the sound of the end. David stood motionless for a long time, listening to the silence that rushed in to fill the space Clara had vacated. It was a different kind of silence than the one he was used to. For years, the silence in this house had been heavy, freighted with unspoken resentments and the suffocating weight of disappointment. This new silence was light. It was empty. It was potential. He walked over to the granite countertop, a vast, gleaming island he had never much liked, and picked up the small, solitary brass key. It felt cool and solid in his palm. He closed his fingers around it, the metal edges pressing into his skin. It was not a key to a locker of junk. It was the key to his future. He didn't smile. It wasn't a moment for triumph, not yet. It was a moment for stillness. He was an architect, after all. He knew that before you can build something new, you must first have a clear and stable foundation. The ground beneath his feet had just been violently cleared, and now, for the first time in a decade, he could finally survey the site of his own life. He spent the next few days in a state of methodical calm. He didn't mourn the loss of the cars. He had always preferred walking. He didn't rage about the empty bank accounts. He had a separate professional account under his firm's name that Clara had never bothered to learn about, deeming his work a little hobby. It contained enough to live on, modestly, for the foreseeable future. He methodically packed the remnants of his life in the oversized mansion. He boxed his clothes, his books, the few personal effects that hadn't been curated by Clara's impeccable and impersonal taste. He moved into a small, one-bedroom apartment downtown, a place with large windows overlooking a park. The rent was reasonable, the space was his own, and the light was fantastic. For the first time in years, he felt the familiar, forgotten stirrings of peace. He arranged his drafting table by the largest window, unrolled a fresh sheet of vellum, and sharpened his pencils. He did not feel like a man who had lost everything. He felt like a man who had been given back the one thing he hadn't realized was missing: himself. The key to the storage unit sat on his new, simple desk, a silent, gleaming promise. The world thought he was a broken man, a fool left with nothing but scraps. But David knew the truth. The story wasn't over. The first act had just concluded, and the curtain was about to rise on the second. A year before the door clicked shut, the humiliation had been a public spectacle, served under the glittering chandeliers of the Ashworth family mansion. It was Richard and Eleanor Ashworth's 40th wedding anniversary, an event catered with champagne that cost more per bottle than David's first car, and attended by a curated list of the city's most influential people. David had always felt like an exhibit in these gatherings, the artistic husband Clara would introduce with a faint, apologetic smile. He stood by a towering floral arrangement, holding a glass of sparkling water, observing the room. It was a skill he had honed, to be present but invisible. He watched Clara move through the crowd, a vision in emerald silk, laughing, touching arms, collecting admiration like a bee collects pollen. She was in her element, a creature born for the light and the attention. He, on the other hand, was a creature of shadow and substance, of quiet lines and foundational integrity. Their marriage had become a constant, grinding conflict between facade and function. Richard Ashworth, a man whose physical presence was as imposing as his bank balance, cornered him by the grand piano. Richard was built like a bull, with a thick neck and a florid complexion that spoke of rich food and expensive whiskey. He clapped a heavy hand on David's shoulder, a gesture that was meant to look avuncular, but felt like an assertion of ownership. "David, hiding in the corner, my boy?" Richard's voice was a low boom that cut through the polite chatter. "Come now, mingle. You architects are supposed to be creative types, aren't you?" David offered a small, polite smile. "Just enjoying the view, Richard. It's a beautiful party." "Beautiful, yes. Eleanor has good taste," Richard said, dismissing his wife's months of planning with a casual wave. He lowered his voice, leaning in conspiratorially. "Listen, David, I've been meaning to talk to you. Clara tells me your little firm is still just you. Treading water, is it?" The condescension was so thick David could almost taste it. "I prefer to keep my practice small," David replied, his voice even. "It allows me to be selective about my projects." Richard let out a short, barking laugh. "Selective, that's a good one. That's what we call it when the phone isn't ringing, eh?" He took a sip of his scotch. "Look, my daughter is used to a certain lifestyle, a lifestyle I've worked my entire life to provide for her. This hobby of yours," he said, the word dripping with disdain, "it's a noble pursuit, I suppose, like building ships in a bottle. But it doesn't pay for trips to Monaco. It doesn't keep a woman like Clara happy." David's jaw tightened, but his expression remained a placid mask. Inside his pocket, his fingers found the cool, familiar shape of the storage unit key. He had begun carrying it with him everywhere, a private talisman, a reminder of a value that men like Richard Ashworth could never comprehend. "My work is fulfilling," David said quietly. "Fulfilling!" Richard boomed again, drawing the attention of a few nearby guests. "Let me tell you what's fulfilling. A quarterly report that shows a 20% growth year over year. That's fulfilling. Closing a deal that puts your competitor out of business. That's fulfilling. David, you're a smart fellow. You have a good mind for details. But you have no ambition, no killer instinct." Clara drifted over, drawn by her father's loud voice. She placed a perfectly manicured hand on her father's arm. "Daddy, don't bully David," she said, but her eyes, when they met David's, held no support. They held a familiar apology, which was a form of judgment in itself. "I'm not bullying him, darling," Richard said, patting her hand. "I'm trying to give him some sound advice. A man has to be a provider. It's the natural order of things." He looked back at David, his eyes gleaming with a kind of predatory pity. "You design buildings, but you can't seem to build a life. It's a paradox, isn't it?" The insult hung in the air, sharp and clear. It wasn't just an attack on his career. It was an attack on his very manhood, delivered in his wife's ancestral home, in front of her peers, with her tacit approval. David felt the familiar burn of shame, but beneath it, something else was taking shape. Not anger, but a cold, hard resolve. He was an architect. He understood structure. He knew that some structures were unsound, built on arrogance and false pretenses. He knew that such structures, no matter how grand they appeared, were destined to collapse. And he knew, with a certainty that was as solid as granite, that the House of Ashworth was one of them. He said nothing. He simply nodded, a gesture they mistook for acquiescence. Defeat. He let Richard clap his shoulder one more time, let Clara guide him away with a sigh of exasperation. He remained by the piano, a statue of quiet dignity. He felt the eyes of the other guests on him, saw the whispers and the pitying looks. They saw a weak man, a failure being kept by his wife's wealthy family. They saw exactly what Clara and Richard wanted them to see. They had no idea they were looking at the man who was, at that very moment, mentally drafting the demolition plans for their entire world. The key in his pocket felt warmer now, no longer just a promise, but a detonator. The storage facility was an unassuming, climate-controlled fortress in an industrial park on the edge of the city. To the casual observer, it was a place for people to store excess furniture, seasonal decorations, or the contents of a life in transition. But Unit 734 was different. It was not a repository of clutter. It was a sanctuary. It was a library. It was an ark. David slid the heavy brass key into the lock. The tumblers shifted with a satisfying mechanical click. He rolled up the corrugated steel door, and the fluorescent lights inside flickered on, revealing not dusty boxes and shrouded sofas, but rows of immaculate, custom-built archival shelving. The air inside was cool and dry, smelling faintly of old paper and wood glue. This was his real home, the place his soul had resided for the past 5 years, ever since his mentor, the legendary and reclusive architect Kaito Tanaka, had passed away. Tanaka had been a ghost in the world of architecture. He had produced a small but revolutionary body of work in the mid-20th century, and then, at the height of his fame, had simply vanished. He'd spent the last 40 years of his life in quiet seclusion, mentoring a single, chosen protege, David. Tanaka had seen in the young, unassuming student a shared reverence for space, light, and integrity. When he died, he left David not money, but his life's work, his entire, priceless archive. David ran his hand along a shelf of rolled, vellum blueprints, each one housed in a labeled, acid-free tube. Here was the original, hand-drawn plan for the House of Tranquil Light, Tanaka's most famous residential project, a building studied in universities across the globe. There were alternate elevations, initial sketches on cocktail napkins, notes in Tanaka's elegant, spidery script arguing with himself about the placement of a single window. On another wall were the models, intricate, breathtakingly detailed scale models of every project Tanaka had ever conceived, both built and unbuilt. There was the model for the Asahi Tower, a radical skyscraper that was never constructed, but had influenced a generation of commercial architects. Its delicate balsa wood and cardstock frame was as perfect as the day Tanaka had glued the last piece into place. David gently touched the corner of a model for a small, unbuilt chapel, a spiraling structure of impossible grace. He had helped Tanaka build this one in the final years of his life. The centerpiece of the collection was a locked, fireproof cabinet. David retrieved a second, smaller key from his wallet and opened it. Inside, nestled on velvet lining, were Tanaka's personal journals, dozens of leather-bound volumes filled with his philosophy, his private thoughts, his frustrations, and his genius. Alongside them were signed, first-edition copies of seminal works by Le Corbusier, Frank Lloyd Wright, and Louis Kahn, each containing personal inscriptions to Tanaka from the authors themselves. This cabinet alone was a Rosetta Stone of modern architectural thought. Clara had been to the unit once, years ago. She had stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her nose wrinkled at the musty smell. She had scanned the shelves with a blank, uncomprehending gaze. "So this is it?" she had asked. "This is where you disappear to? It's just Old paper and toys. Old paper and toys. 6 months after that visit, David had discreetly hired a specialist from a major auction house to appraise the collection for insurance purposes. The appraiser, a woman with decades of experience in historical documents and art, had spent 2 days in the unit. Her initial professional composure had slowly dissolved into a state of near reverent awe. She had handled the blueprints as if they were sacred texts. She had stared at the unbuilt models with tears in her eyes. Her final report had been delivered in a hushed, almost conspiratorial tone. She had valued the blueprints and original drawings at $4 million. The models, particularly the unbuilt ones, which were unique artifacts of a master's imagination, she valued at $2.5 million. The books, journals, and correspondence, she estimated, would fetch at least $1.5 million at a specialized auction, a conservative total of $8 million. Mr. Hayes, she had said, her voice trembling slightly, this is not a collection. This is a legacy. There are museums that would kill to have a fraction of what is in this room. This is Kaito Tanaka's soul. David had thanked her, paid her fee, and placed the appraisal report in the fireproof cabinet alongside Tanaka's journals. He never spoke of it to Clara. It wasn't a secret he was keeping out of malice, not at first. It was something so deeply personal, so sacred, that he couldn't bear to have it subjected to her dismissive gaze, to have it measured in the only currency she understood, what it could buy. Kaito Tanaka had entrusted him with his soul, and David would not allow that soul to be priced for a new car or a trip to Monaco. Now, standing in the silent, hallowed space, he felt no sense of vindictive glee. Instead, he felt a profound sense of responsibility. Tanaka had given him this legacy not for it to be hoarded, but for it to be honored. The world thought Kaito Tanaka had vanished without a trace. The world was about to learn how wrong it was. And in the process, the Ashworths would learn a lesson not about the value of money, but about the pricelessness of true worth. He gently rolled up a specific blueprint, the preliminary sketch for the unbuilt chapel, and placed it in a protective tube. He had a meeting to prepare for. The foundation was set. The demolition was planned. It was time to start construction. 6 months after Clara's departure, the invitation arrived. It was thick, cream-colored cardstock, embossed with the Ashworth family crest. Richard and Eleanor Ashworth requested the pleasure of his company at their 41st wedding anniversary party. It was, David knew, not an olive branch. It was a summons, a command performance for his own public shaming. Clara had been flaunting her new relationship with a hedge fund manager named Julian Croft, a man who fit the Ashworth mold perfectly, slick, rich, and utterly devoid of discernible substance. David knew this party was meant to be the final, public exhibition of his failure and Clara's triumphant upgrade. He accepted. When he arrived at the mansion, the valet, a young man who had parked his modest sedan dozens of times, gave him a look of genuine pity. "Good to see you, Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice soft. It was a kindness that felt sharper than any insult. Walking into the grand ballroom was like stepping back into the scene of the crime. The same chandeliers, the same cloying scent of lilies and wealth. But this time the atmosphere was different. The pity was no longer subtle. It was a palpable force in the room. Guests who had once offered him strange smiles now avoided his gaze entirely. He was a social leper, the ghost of Clara's past. He saw her across the room, standing beside Julian. Julian was handsome in a generic, boardroom-approved way, with perfect teeth and a watch that probably had its own security detail. He had his hand resting possessively on the small of Clara's back. She was laughing, a bright, brittle sound that didn't quite reach her eyes. When she saw David, her smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recalibrated, composing her face into an expression of benevolent sympathy. She detached herself from Julian and glided towards him. "David, I'm so surprised you came." "You invited me, Clara," he said, his voice calm. "Well, yes, of course," she said, as if it were a formality she never expected him to observe. I hope this isn't too awkward for you," Seeing everyone, she gestured around the room. Are you doing all right? I worry about you. It was a masterful performance. The concerned ex-wife. Every word was a perfectly sharpened dart. I worry about you meant I know you are pathetic. Seeing everyone meant everyone is watching you fail. I'm doing very well, thank you, he said. Her eyes flickered with annoyance at his refusal to play the part of the tragic victim. Before she could respond, Richard Ashworth descended upon them. David, you've got guts, I'll give you that, Richard boomed, slapping him on the back with enough force to make a lesser man stumble. Good to see you're not hiding away in that little apartment of yours. His eyes swept over David's simple, well-tailored but unassuming suit. Things have been difficult, I hear. It was the same phrase Clara had used, a family script. Things have been clarifying, David corrected him gently. Richard ignored this. Listen, he said, lowering his voice. I feel a certain responsibility for you, for Clara's sake. I have an opening in the mailroom at Ashworth Corp. A man's got to have a purpose, right? It's steady work, benefits. It would give you some structure, help you get back on your feet. The offer was the pinnacle of condescension. It was so outrageously insulting that it was almost sublime. He wanted to break David completely, to turn him into a literal servant in the empire he had built, a living trophy of his own dominance. He wanted David to fetch his coffee, to sort the mail that brought news of his ever-expanding wealth, while David's own potential rotted away. Standing nearby, David saw Clara's brother, Mark. Mark was the quiet one in the family, an accountant who lacked his father's brutish charisma and his sister's glittering ruthlessness. Their eyes met for a moment. David saw a flicker of profound shame in Mark's expression before he looked away, taking a sudden, intense interest in the contents of his champagne flute. The silent enabler. His cowardice was, in its own way, as damning as his father's cruelty. David looked from Mark's averted gaze back to Richard's smug, expectant face. He felt a moment of pure, cold clarity. The humiliation was complete. They had done everything they could to strip him of his dignity, to reduce him to a caricature of a man. And in their supreme arrogance, they had handed him the moral authority to do what needed to be done. He didn't lash out. He didn't raise his voice. He simply smiled, a small, genuine smile that did not reach his eyes. That's a very generous offer, Richard, he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. Thank you for thinking of me. I'll certainly give it the consideration it deserves. Richard beamed, mistaking David's composure for surrender. Atta boy, knew you had some sense in you. He clapped David's shoulder again. Now, go get a real drink. You look like you need it. As Richard walked away, triumphant, David's hand went into his pocket. He didn't touch the key this time. Instead, his fingers brushed against a small, folded piece of paper. It was a confirmation slip from a courier service. A package had been delivered that afternoon to the Tokyo headquarters of the Sato Global Corporation. A package containing a single, rolled-up blueprint of an unbuilt chapel and a letter. The final pieces were moving into place. The game was no longer theirs to control. They just didn't know it yet. The days following the anniversary party were a study in quiet precision. While the Ashworths likely imagined him languishing in his small apartment, contemplating the magnanimous offer of a mailroom job, David was executing a plan that had been years in the making. There was no rage, no frantic energy. There was only the calm, methodical process of an architect finalizing the specifications for a new structure. His first stop was the office of Isabelle Rocher, a lawyer known for her sharp mind and her utter intolerance for bullies. Her office was not opulent like the ones at Ashworth Corp. It was functional, elegant, and filled with books. She had keen, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. They offered you a job in the mailroom? She asked, a single eyebrow raised in disbelief as David recounted the events of the party. She leaned back in her chair. The arrogance is almost impressive. It's a caricature of itself. It was clarifying, David said. using the same word he had used with Richard. Indeed, Isabel agreed. She slid a document across her desk. Well, their arrogance is now our greatest asset. This is the final divorce settlement they sent over last week. I've reviewed it. It's as predatory as you'd expect. She gets the house, the accounts we know about, the investment portfolio. You get, well, you get your freedom and your personal effects. David picked up the document. He scanned the pages, his eyes moving with practiced efficiency. Then he found the clause he was looking for. Section 7B, under Division of Assets. It was a short, dismissive paragraph concerning the contents of Storage Unit 734. It described the contents as miscellaneous personal items, including papers, books, and hobby materials, possessing sentimental value only. It explicitly stated that Clara Ashworth relinquishes any and all present or future claims to said items. Sentimental value only, David read aloud, his voice flat. Her words, via her lawyer, Isabel confirmed. She wanted to make it clear she wanted none of your junk, as I believe she called it. In her rush to be insulting, she has handed us a gift-wrapped legal position. By signing this, she is contractually disavowing any financial interest in that unit, regardless of its actual worth. Good, David said simply. He looked up at Isabel. The other arrangements are in place. Mr. Sato's office confirmed? They did. He is flying in from Tokyo himself. He was moved by the material I sent. David thought of the letter he had written, explaining his desire not just to sell the archive, but to partner with a foundation that would honor Tanaka's legacy, to create something new from it. He hadn't appealed to Sato's wallet, he had appealed to his soul. Isabel nodded, a slow, satisfied smile spreading across her face. Richard Ashworth has been trying to get a meeting with Kenji Sato for 5 years. Sato is the white whale of international investment. The Ashworth Tower, for all its glitter, is small potatoes compared to the projects Sato finances. I'm aware, David said, which is why the final signing needs to happen in a very specific location. The boardroom, Isabel finished for him, her smile widening. At the top of Ashworth Tower, the belly of the beast. It's a matter of structure, David explained, of symbolism. The entire narrative they've constructed is about their power, their status, their environment. The final act has to take place on their stage. Poetic and brutal. I like it, Isabel said. She picked up her phone. I will call her lawyer. I'll say you're ready to sign, but as a final gesture of goodwill and closure, you request the signing take place at Mr. Ashworth's office. A final, respectful acknowledgement of the family's importance in your life. They won't be able to resist that, David said. It was a perfect appeal to their ego. They would see it as his final, pathetic act of supplication, the vanquished foe paying tribute to the victor on his own ground. No, they won't, Isabel agreed. They'll be tripping over themselves to accommodate your respectful request. They'll probably have champagne on ice. Later that day, David stood by the large window in his apartment, looking down at the park. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grass. Children were playing on the swings, their laughter carrying faintly on the breeze. It was a simple, beautiful scene. For 10 years, he had lived in a world of artifice, of polished surfaces that reflected nothing real. He had been so focused on enduring, on surviving, that he had forgotten what it felt like to simply live. He received a text from Isabel. It's set, Thursday, 10 a.m., their boardroom. They were, and I quote, delighted to accommodate. David felt a profound stillness settle over him. It wasn't the giddy thrill of impending revenge. It was the deep, quiet satisfaction of a complex plan clicking into place. It was the feeling an architect gets when the drawings are complete, the calculations are double-checked, and the foundations are ready to be poured. The quiet before the storm. The storm was coming for the House of Ashworth, and David Hayes, the man they had dismissed as a gentle, ineffective breeze, was about to reveal himself as the hurricane. The boardroom at Ashworth Tower was on the 50th floor, a glass-walled cage suspended in the sky. It was designed to intimidate, to showcase power. One wall was a seamless window, offering a god-king's view of the city below. The opposite wall was adorned with a massive, abstract painting that screamed of expensive, inaccessible taste. At the center of the room was a vast, dark mahogany table, polished to a mirror shine, so large it felt less like a piece of furniture and more like a tectonic plate. David and his lawyer, Isabelle Rocher, were seated first. They had arrived 5 minutes early, a deliberate choice. It allowed them to occupy the space, to acclimate, to own their position at the table. David sat with his back to the window, forcing the others to look at him against the backdrop of the sprawling city he knew so intimately. Clara arrived exactly on time, flanked by her father, Richard, and their lawyer, a slick, silver-haired man named Arthur Vance. They entered the room with the easy confidence of people who believe they have already won. Clara wore a sharp, cream-colored suit, her armor of choice. She offered David a tight, triumphant smile. Richard was practically glowing with self-satisfaction, the benevolent victor granting a final audience to the defeated. "David, Isabel," Arthur Vance said, his voice smooth and condescending as he took his seat. "Thank you for coming. We trust we can make this process as swift and painless as possible." "We're here to sign the papers, Arthur. Let's get on with it," Richard grunted, settling his bulk into a chair that seemed to groan under his weight. Clara sat opposite David, her purse placed precisely on the table beside her. She didn't look at him, instead focusing on a point just over his shoulder, as if he were already a part of her past, a blurry figure in her rearview mirror. Arthur slid a leather-bound folder across the gleaming table. It stopped perfectly in front of David. "As we discussed," Arthur said, "this is the final settlement agreement. Generous, I think you'll find. Just requires your signature on the last page." David looked at the folder. He did not open it. He did not pick up the heavy, gold-plated pen that lay beside it. He let the silence stretch, a quiet, deliberate pause that began to fray the edges of their smug composure. Richard shifted in his seat, impatient. "Well, what are you waiting for, David? An engraved invitation?" David finally raised his eyes, meeting Richard's gaze directly. His own eyes were calm, clear, and unblinking. "Before I sign," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute authority in the silent room, "there is a small matter to address, an incorrectly categorized asset." Clara finally looked at him, an expression of pure annoyance on her face. "Oh, for God's sake, David, don't be petty. What now? Are you going to fight me for the wedding china?" "No, Clara," David replied, his tone even. "Not the china. I'm referring to the contents of storage unit 734. A short, derisive laugh escaped Clara's lips. "The junk? You can't be serious. I told you it's all yours. I don't want any of your dusty old papers." "Yes, you did," David agreed. "You described it in this very document," he tapped the folder, "as having sentimental value only. And you relinquished all claims to it. I just want to ensure that is still your position, now that the asset has been formally valued." Arthur Vance leaned forward, a frown creasing his brow. "Valued? By whom? It's a collection of personal effects." "It's a collection," David corrected him gently, "of historical and artistic significance. Specifically, it is the complete and sole archive of the architect Kaito Tanaka." The name landed in the room with no effect. To the Ashworths and their lawyer, it was just a foreign-sounding name, meaningless. Richard waved a dismissive hand. "Never heard of him. If you think some old drawings are going to change this settlement, you're more naive than I thought." "Perhaps," David said, "but I don't believe everyone would share your assessment." As if on cue, the heavy boardroom door swung open silently. A slender, severe-looking woman in a dark suit held it open. Through the door stepped an elderly Japanese man. He was small in stature, but his presence seemed to alter the very atmosphere of the room. He was dressed in a simple but exquisitely tailored dark gray suit. his white hair neatly combed, his face a mask of serene dignity. Behind him were two younger associates, a man and a woman, both carrying briefcases. Richard Ashworth's jaw went slack. His florid complexion paled. He recognized the man instantly. Every major player in global finance and development recognized him. It was Kenji Sato, the legendary head of the Sato Global Corporation, a man Richard had been trying to get a 5-minute phone call with for the better part of a decade. Sato's eyes scanned the room, passing over the stunned faces of the Ashworths as if they were part of the furniture. His gaze settled on David. A slow, respectful smile touched his lips. He approached the table and gave a slight, formal bow. "David-san," Kenji Sato said, his voice quiet but resonant. "It is an honor to finally meet you in person. Your letter and the materials you sent, they were a gift to an old man's heart." The room was utterly, profoundly silent. The city noise, so present moments before, seemed to have faded away. Clara stared, her mouth slightly agape, her mind frantically trying to process what was happening. Her world, so ordered and predictable, had just been breached by a variable she could not compute. Richard looked as if he had been struck by lightning. David stood and returned the bow. "Sato-san, thank you for coming. The honor is all mine." The reversal had begun. The foundations of their world had just been hit with a seismic shock, and the cracks were beginning to show. Kenji Sato turned his calm, assessing gaze from David to the other occupants of the table. He looked at Richard Ashworth, whose face was a comical mask of shock and confusion. He looked at Clara, whose carefully constructed composure was visibly shattering. He looked at their lawyer, who seemed to be trying to shrink into his expensive suit. "You are Mr. Ashworth," Sato said to Richard. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the flat intonation of a man identifying a specimen. Richard, flustered, scrambled to his feet, knocking his chair back slightly. "Mr. Sato, yes, Richard Ashworth. This is an incredible, an unexpected honor. I've been an admirer of your work for years. Years." He extended a hand, which Sato regarded for a moment before giving a short, almost imperceptible nod, forcing Richard to let his hand drop awkwardly back to his side. Sato's attention then moved to David. "David-san," he said, his voice now warm with respect. "My foundation's board of directors met yesterday. They were unanimous. We are formally prepared to acquire the Kaito Tanaka archive for the centerpiece of our new Museum of Design and Innovation in Kyoto." Isabelle Rocher, who had been watching the scene with the quiet satisfaction of a chess master watching a checkmate unfold, chose this moment to speak. "And the acquisition price, Mr. Sato? For the record." Sato gave a small smile. "Of course. As per our agreement with Mr. Hayes, the Sato Foundation will be purchasing the archive for the sum of $8 million US. The statement landed in the room with the force of a physical blow. $8 million. It was not a number they could process. It was an absurdity. Clara made a small, choking sound, as if the air had been stolen from her lungs. Her eyes, wide with disbelief, darted from Sato to David and back again. The junk. The dusty papers in toy buildings. $8 million. Richard Ashworth sank back into his chair, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. The gears of his mind were grinding, trying to reconcile the image of his pathetic, failed son-in-law with this new reality. The man he had offered a mailroom job to was sitting on a fortune that rivaled a significant portion of his own liquid assets. Arthur Vance, the lawyer, was the first to recover his voice, though it was strained. "This is highly irregular. This asset was not disclosed during discovery." Isabel laughed, a sharp, clear sound in the tense silence. "Oh, but it was, Arthur. We have it right here." She tapped the settlement agreement that still lay untouched in front of David. Section 7B, described as items of sentimental value only. My client agreed with your client's assessment. He is so sentimental, in fact, that he has decided to keep it. She slid a new, single-page document across the table. This is a simple addendum. It acknowledges the formal valuation of the asset in Unit 734 and reaffirms that, as per the original agreement drafted by you, your client, Ms. Ashworth, relinquishes all claims to it. We just want everything to be transparent before my client signs the final papers. We wouldn't want any misunderstandings later on. The sheer, elegant brutality of the maneuver was breathtaking. They had used the Ashworths' own arrogance, their own words, their own condescension as the foundation for their complete and total defeat. Clara finally found her voice. It was shrill, unrecognizable. No, no, that's our money. We were married. He hid that from me. She stood up, her knuckles white where she gripped the table. She pointed a trembling finger at David. You lied to me. You tricked me. David looked at her, and for the first time, he felt not anger, not pain, but a deep and profound pity. I never lied, Clara, he said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the swirling chaos. You never asked. You looked at my life's passion, the legacy of a man I loved like a father, and you saw junk. The valuation didn't change, only your perception of it. The quiet bomb had detonated. The mirror was now in front of her, and the reflection was hideous. The silence that followed was the sound of a world breaking. The opulent boardroom, once a symbol of their power, had become a courtroom, and judgment had just been rendered. The immediate aftermath was a symphony of desperation. Clara, her face pale and streaked with tears that ruined her perfect makeup, collapsed into her chair. The shrill accusations subsided, replaced by a frantic, disjointed pleading. David, please, she whispered, her voice hoarse. You can't do this. 10 years. We had 10 years. That means something, doesn't it? The house, my expenses. I planned my life based on what we had. This changes everything. The we was telling. For years there had been no we. There had been her life and his, a satellite in a slowly decaying orbit around it. Now, faced with the consequence of her own choices, she was desperately trying to reconstitute a partnership she herself had demolished. Richard Ashworth, ever the opportunist, recovered more quickly. His mind, trained for decades to spot angles and leverage, pivoted with astonishing speed. The shock on his face was replaced by a broad, predatory smile. He stood up and walked around the table, placing a heavy hand on David's shoulder. The same gesture of dominance he had used at the party, but this time it was imbued with a desperate, cloying familiarity. David, my boy, you sly dog, he boomed, his voice unnaturally jovial. You should have told me. An $8 million asset. We could have leveraged this, partnered. The Sato deal is just the beginning. With my capital and your asset and Sato's connections, we could build an empire. He was already seeing the future, a future in which he could absorb David's success and claim it as his own. Forget this divorce nonsense. This is a celebration. We're family. David slowly, deliberately, reached up and removed Richard's hand from his shoulder. He looked at the hand, then at Richard's face, his expression unreadable. He remained seated, forcing the larger man to look down at him. The power dynamic in the room had been irrevocably inverted. Family, David repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. He then turned his calm gaze to Clara, then back to Richard. And then he began to speak, his voice quiet, but each word landing with the percussive force of a hammer blow. He began to recite the list of grievances. A year ago, at your anniversary party, you told me my life's work was a noble hobby, like building ships in a bottle. You told me I had no ambition, no killer instinct. You questioned my ability to provide for your daughter. He turned to Clara. At that same party, you stood by and said nothing. You looked at me with pity, apologizing for my presence. When you left our home, you told me to keep my dusty junk because it was all I was good for. He looked back at Richard. 6 months ago, at this year's party, in front of your friends and colleagues, you offered me a job. In your mailroom. You thought the most fitting place for me was sorting your letters. A purpose to get me back on my feet. He let the words hang in the air. The boardroom was silent save for Clara's quiet, ragged sobs. Richard's forced smile had vanished, replaced by a grim, tight-lipped fury. You didn't see a partner, Clara. You saw a project that failed. You didn't see a son-in-law, Richard. You saw an employee you could barely tolerate. You have both made your assessments of my worth very clear over the past several years, David continued, his voice unwavering. The only thing that has changed today is the price tag, and my worth, my real worth, is not for sale. Not to you, not to anyone. He picked up the gold-plated pen. With a steady hand, he signed the addendum Isabel had prepared, his signature a clean, decisive stroke. Then he pushed that paper toward his lawyer and pulled the original settlement agreement toward him. He signed the last page, finalizing their divorce under the exact terms Clara had demanded. He was free. He stood up. Mr. Sato and his associates, who had been standing by the door in silent observation, also stood. Our business here is concluded, David said to the room at large. He looked past his ex-wife and her father, his gaze settling on Mark, Clara's brother, who had been invited to the signing as a family witness and had remained utterly silent throughout the entire exchange. Mark had been watching, his face a canvas of conflicting emotions, shame, regret, and a dawning, reluctant admiration. David didn't say a word to him. He didn't need to. He simply held his gaze for a moment. In that moment, Mark Ashworth was faced with a choice. He could remain seated, a silent partner in his family's wreckage, or he could stand. After a long, agonizing pause, Mark pushed his chair back and rose to his feet. He looked at his father, then his sister. He's right, Mark said, his voice quiet but firm. He's right about all of it. This is what you wanted. Without another word, Mark turned and walked out of the boardroom, leaving his family to sit amongst the ruins of their own making. David gave a final, formal nod to Mr. Sato, and together they followed, leaving the Ashworths alone in their glass cage, with their magnificent view of a city that suddenly felt very far away. The months that followed the signing were a period of profound reconstruction for David, and of slow, grinding collapse for the Ashworths. The news of the Sato Foundation's acquisition of the Tanaka Archive and its partnership with the newly formed Hayes Design Institute made waves not just in the architectural world, but in the financial pages as well. The story was too compelling to ignore. The hidden legacy, the dramatic reveal, the quiet architect who had outmaneuvered one of the city's most powerful families. The narrative they had so carefully crafted of David's failure was publicly and permanently shattered. David, for his part, ignored the noise. He poured his energy and the initial funds from the sale into his new firm. He leased a beautiful, light-filled studio space in a restored heritage building downtown, a building he himself had admired for years. His new office was the antithesis of the Ashworth Tower boardroom. It was filled with natural wood, soft light, and the quiet hum of creative work. He hired a small, brilliant team of young architects and designers who shared his passion for meaningful, human-centric design. His first project in collaboration with the Sato Foundation was not a flashy skyscraper or a luxury condominium. It was the design for a new public library and community arts center in a neglected, low-income neighborhood. It was the realization of a dream he had shared with his mentor, Kaito Tanaka. The idea that great architecture was not about ego, but about service. That beauty and dignity were not luxuries for the rich, but rights for everyone. David was not just building a structure, he was rebuilding a community's sense of worth. Meanwhile, the House of Ashworth was crumbling. The story of Richard's humiliation at the hands of the man he had tried to hire for his mailroom became a popular anecdote at the exclusive clubs and cocktail parties he frequented. His peers, men who respected only strength and success, now saw him as a fool who had let an $8 million asset slip through his fingers due to his own arrogance. Deals he had once closed with a handshake now required rigorous, untrusting scrutiny. The aura of invincibility he had cultivated for 40 years had been punctured. Clara's life unraveled even more dramatically. Her new partner, Julian Croft, the hedge fund manager, had been attracted to her status as an Ashworth heiress. When that status became tarnished by public ridicule and the story of her epic misjudgment, his ardor cooled considerably. He quietly ended their relationship a few months after the story broke, citing a need to focus on his work. Without David's steady, unseen financial contributions, and now cut off from the lavish lifestyle her father's booming reputation had once afforded, Clara was forced to sell the mansion. The proceeds were significant, but not enough to sustain the life she had known. She moved into a luxury condo that, while comfortable by any normal standard, felt like a prison to her. Her friends, the ones who had flocked to her parties and admired her clothes, now kept a polite distance. Her social currency, built on a foundation of wealth and status, was worthless. She was left with nothing but her bitterness and the haunting knowledge of what she had thrown away. Not the money, but the man who had loved her in spite of her flaws. The man whose quiet strength she had mistaken for weakness. One afternoon, David received a call from Mark Ashworth. They met for coffee at a small, neutral cafe, far from either of their usual orbits. Mark looked older, more tired, but there was a new steadiness in his eyes. "I wanted to apologize," Mark said, stirring his coffee. "For all of it. For all the years I stood by and said nothing. I was a coward." "You were loyal to your family," David said without judgment. "No," Mark corrected him. "I was afraid of my father, and I was complicit. Walking out of that room was the first honest thing I'd done in years." He looked at David. "I quit the family firm. I'm starting my own small accounting practice for small businesses. People like you, well, the you I thought you were." David nodded, understanding. "That takes courage." "It feels right," Mark said. "My father hasn't spoken to me since. Clara calls occasionally, to cry or to rage. She still doesn't get it. She thinks you stole from her. She can't see that she's the one who gave it all away." He paused, then looked David in the eye. "I hope you're happy, David. Truly. You deserve it." "I am," David said, and he was surprised by the simple, profound truth of the statement. "I'm at peace." They finished their coffee, two men from different worlds who had been brought together by a painful intersection and were now moving on, in their own ways, toward a more authentic life. As David walked back to his sunlit studio, he felt a sense of closure. The scales had been balanced. Justice hadn't been about revenge, it had been about restoration. The restoration of his own life and the natural, inevitable consequences that had restored a painful but necessary balance to the lives of the Ashworths. The final design was complete. Months have a way of turning into a year, and a year has a way of laying a new foundation over the rubble of the past. David stood on the construction site of the new Northwood Public Library and Arts Center. The steel skeleton of the building rose against the crisp autumn sky, a promise taking physical form. He held a rolled-up blueprint in his hand, the lines and figures representing not just concrete and glass, but hope. His firm was thriving, not by chasing massive, ego-driven projects, but by selecting work that had meaning. They designed affordable housing, a children's health clinic, a park pavilion. David Hayes was becoming known not as the man who had won $8 million in a dramatic divorce, but as an architect who was quietly and beautifully reshaping the fabric of the city. He had found that his true wealth was not the money from the archive, but the freedom it had purchased. The freedom to pursue his passion without compromise. The freedom to live a life aligned with his own values. The money was a tool, and he was using it to build things that would outlast him, things that would serve others. It was the ultimate tribute to the legacy of Kaito Tanaka. He occasionally heard things about the Ashworths, Richard had reportedly suffered some significant financial setbacks, his Midas touch apparently having failed him since his public fall from grace. His reputation for ruthless competence had been replaced by a reputation for foolish arrogance, a far more damaging label in his world. Clara, David had heard, had moved to a smaller city, trying to escape the shadow of her story. She had tried through lawyers to reopen the divorce settlement twice, both attempts failing spectacularly and costing her a small fortune in legal fees. She remained a prisoner of her own choices, forever looking back at a door she had closed, a key she had discarded, and a treasure she had been blind to. David felt no satisfaction in their downfall. He felt only a quiet sense of melancholy for the waste. They had possessed so much: wealth, influence, opportunity, and had used it to build a hollow life, a beautiful facade with nothing behind it. He, on the other hand, had been left with what they considered nothing, and from it, he was building everything. As the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden light over the steel beams, David unrolled the blueprint he was holding. It was a copy of Tanaka's sketch for the unbuilt chapel, the one he had sent to Mr. Sato. Tucked into the corner of the new library's design was a small, quiet meditation garden. Its layout was a subtle, respectful echo of that spiraling chapel, a legacy honored, a promise kept. He thought about the nature of value, how some things like integrity, passion, and self-respect have a worth that can never be quantified on a balance sheet, how true strength isn't loud and domineering, but quiet, patient, and resilient. It's the strength of a foundation that can withstand a storm, the integrity of a well-drawn line that becomes a beautiful, enduring space. What do you think is the most valuable thing a person can have? It's a question we all face in one way or another. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Your stories and insights are what make this community so special. Thank you for spending this time with me today. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe for more tales of justice, redemption, and the quiet triumph of the human spirit. Until next time, build your life on a strong foundation.